March 27th, 1917. Meeting with the President. He wondered whether he should ask Congress to declare war or state that war already exists and request the necessary means to carry it through. I advised the latter option. If he puts a declaration of war up to Congress, there might well be an acrimonious debate. I then told him how anxious I was that as a war president, he should meet the challenges in a creditable way, so that when the conflict's over, his reputation and influence are not reduced, and he's able to do the great work that will follow. I took the liberty to suggest to him that he might not be well suited to the immediate task. Too refined, too civilized, too intellectual, too cultivated. It needs a man of coarser fiber, someone less of a philosopher, to conduct a brutal, vigorous, successful war. He agreed.
March 30th. Perfect weather, but Woodrow felt that he must work on his message to Congress. So we closed the door and gave orders that no one was to disturb him. We lunched alone.
London.
My accusation is this.
The American Embassy.
He soothed the American people, encouraged them to be supine, sat them down in comfortable chairs and said, just stay there.
March 31st. Woodrow has continued work on his war message. As usual, a draft in shorthand, then correcting it in a combination of shorthand and longhand, then making a fair copy on his typewriter. Meanwhile, I lightened the workload by decoding some cipher messages that had come in.
To the belligerents, he was offensively condescending, conceived a vision of himself as President Peacemaker. But now, at last, he's been pushed into action. Now, his big idea will be to show how he led the people into a glorious war in defense of democracy. The plain truth is, this whole wretched business has been a catalog of errors.
April 1st. The message is finished.
This is a man who likes to shut himself away, engage in what he calls thought. The air currents of the world never ventilate his mind, and he maintains his inactive position for as long as public sentiment allows. He's not a leader, he's not a peacemaker, he's a stubborn phrase maker.
April 2nd. Congress convened at 12 noon. When we reached the Capitol, the crowd outside was almost as large as on Inauguration Day. In the gallery, every seat was taken. Woodrow came in. Everyone rose to their feet, and my heart seemed to stop beating. He delivered the speech. There was utter silence until he pronounced the words, "We will not choose the path of submission," whereupon Chief Justice White, an ex-Confederate soldier, got up and cheered. The response from the floor and the galleries was deafening.
Woodrow Wilson, the last United States president to not work with a speechwriter. He used 8 words that changed American foreign policy forever, and in declaring war, changed the direction of the United States and set us on the path that we are still on today. But back in 1917, to what extent do you think the American public really believed that we were getting into war because of U-boats or because of the Zimmerman telegram? You both were talking about other sentiments and other things that Americans were also drawn to at the time.
Well, it's my view, we like to simplify our history, and picking one pivotal moment where it all turns and changes, and especially something as important as a declaration of war, it's a comforting way to tell our history. So we can look at ships going down. Maine gets attacked, Lusitania, Pearl Harbor, and this sort of explains very complex decisions about us fighting our wars. It's my view that the Zimmerman telegram, the resumption of unconditional submarine warfare, that these were not things that dramatically changed anybody's minds. They reaffirmed views that people already had. And the majority of people had already turned to favoring the Allies over Germany. But those people that had not made that transformation were also not persuaded by these events either. There were a lot of people who looked at the Zimmerman telegram who were against entering the war, who believed this was not a credible threat. There's no way Germany could make good on this. This was bluffing. And also looked at unconditional submarine warfare as aimed at stopping British shipping from the United States. And said if we were going to, punish Britain for violating international law the same way that we were punishing Germany, there would be no problem. So they weren't persuasive events, but they were just cumulative events that ultimately convinced Wilson that the time to move was now, that a German victory would threaten the national security of the United States, and also it was the moment at which he embraced, and I would argue that one of the things that Wilson gives us is not just nice phrases for us to repeat, but he gives us this enduring faith that we've embraced in the 20th century, that war is a way to make the world a better place, that through war you can accomplish good things. And I think this has been a recurring theme that we've seen ever since the First World War.
In 1917, a popular poster is Americans All. Jay, how united was the United States towards this war effort?
It's a good question. It's a difficult question sometimes to answer in absence of the polling data that we have today. There is no question that the divisions which we were discussing earlier persisted. Now, in that march to war, so in that first several months of 1917, when you have all of the acceleration of these events happening, which I agree, it's the cumulative effect, isn't it? It's not one thing just sets off the war. It's the cumulative effect, and it's how it puts those who are opposing war or intervention on the defensive, on the back foot. It's very difficult to sustain that argument over time, and it gets more difficult in early 1917. That being said, there are still divisions, you betcha. Now, if you look at the votes in Congress on Wilson's war message, they're fairly decisive. There's a few dissenting votes in the Senate. There's rather more in Congress, in the House. But still, it is a decisive vote. The opponents of intervention had really drawn the line in the sand a little bit earlier. And the local example is of course, Senator Stone from Missouri, who was a Wilsonite. He was for Wilson in 1912, a Democrat, for him in 1916, but opposes those war measures in the run-up to April 1917, and in particular, the big issue, the last sort of stand for congressmen and senators of this kind was the decision to arm those merchant ships, which was, in essence, an admission that the United States would be involved in war. Now, it's very interesting. Stone turns back. He supports Wilson in April 1917. He falls into line, but that disunity within the Democratic Party and more generally will persist. We can see it in all the legislation of once you declare war, there's so many other issues you've got to decide: taxation, finance, resource mobilization, and all of those things will be deeply contentious. One more thing to say, it was very interesting to hear that clip about the ex-Confederate Supreme Court justice and that sort of cathartic moment of sectional reconciliation and how that was interpreted, or how older Americans, and I guess even younger Americans in 1917, would have seen what was happening through the prism of the American Civil War, which still cast such a shadow over everything that was happening in the United States. We often talk about the Spanish-American War of 1898 as that moment of reconciliation. It was interesting to hear that that was still how some Americans interpreted 1917.
And I would just add on to this that while it's hard to as you say, sort of parse out all segments of public opinion because we have imperfect measures. It's important to realize that Wilson himself was concerned that there still remained a significant anti-war constituency in the United States. So let's look at some of the first things that he proposes, which is press censorship. This is something that Congress refuses to authorize, but he wants. They compromise and they have the Espionage Act in 1917, which will be, of course, strengthened dramatically in 1918 with the Sedition Act. But this idea that we will immediately have to silence those people who voted against the war, who spoke out against the war, that they will no longer be able to express those opinions, not because their opinions by themselves matter, because they may in fact influence other people as we fight a long, bloody, difficult war that people expect to take several years, that this sense that he's not 100% sure he has the country behind him, I think really is demonstrated in this immediate attempt to centralize that kind of power, which we have also not seen a government try to do since much earlier in our nation's history.
And one